right, good evening. It's so great to see everyone here today. My name is Meg Tucker. I'm the programs manager here, and this is my last lecture to introduce. I'm moving to Fort Worth, but I will miss you all very much. And, and this has been so fun. The museum, we work so hard because of history lovers like you. So thank you all so much for being here and for participating and coming to our exhibits. It is my joy today to introduce our speaker. I was searching for someone who could tie into the From the Vault exhibit because for those of you who have seen the exhibit, there's a great section about E.E. Townsend and his impact on the founding of Big Bend National Park. And I was looking for any speaker I could find with E.E. Townsend when I stumbled upon Tim Cooper and his grandfather's legacy promoting Big Bend National Park through photography. And he was a notable naturalist and photographer, and so I was just, so excited and reached out, and Tim was very kind and said, of course I'll come talk. And so if you're wondering how these lectures come about, it's a lot of me cold calling people who I think are interesting. Tim Cooper is a retired physician and scientist who has been photographing with intent since he was a child. He is a self-taught, though highly experienced photographer who thrives on both technique and intuition. I found him because he served as photography artist in residence in Big Bend National Park in 2024. And as I mentioned before, I couldn't believe my luck when I found out his deep legacy with the national park and with photography. His grandfather, Peter Koch, was a legendary naturalist, filmmaker, photographer of far west Texas from the 1940s through the 70s. And you'll hear more about him today and his strong legacy. I hope you will take a minute, even if you don't buy one, to look at the 2 and the 3 books at the exit. One of them really caught my eye, Lizards on the Mantle and Donkeys at the Door. And these are by Tim Cooper's mother and grandmother, and about his grandmother's life from the big city to the Wild West of Big Bend and trying to make a go of it with this naturalist grandfather. I mean, it was an adventure, things that we hear about a lot and talk about a lot at the museum, but a memoir like that is really special, especially with this family connection. So I hope you will join me in welcoming Tim Cooper.
My timer just went to an ad. Started over again. Thank you, Meg. That was very kind. Appreciate the invitation, and I'm very excited to be here myself. This opportunity to talk this evening about Peter Koch, my grandfather, a naturalist, photographer, and an explorer, has come at an opportune time for me. I've been working the last 4 years or so on a bigger project, a project to show our work and to discuss the links between our photography, my grandfather's and mine. I'm so fortunate that my mother's family were congenital letter writers and preservers and scrapbookers, so that there's been more than the usual amount of original material to dig through. My mother also had the foresight to donate virtually all of Peter Koch's photography, correspondence, and other material to the then newly established archives of the Big Bend at Sul Ross University in Alpine. Also note that all of Koch's photographs here are shown with the courtesy of the archives. Yeah. Koch wrote a weekly column in the Alpine Avalanche entitled Exploring the Big Bend with Peter Koch, from which the source material for my mother's compilation in the book Exploring the Big Bend Country and published in 2007. And I'm also thankful to her for also compiling and editing the writings of my grandmother, Etta Koch, in Lizards on the Mantle and Burrows on the Door, published in 1999. And finally, I want to thank my sister, Lori Coopersmith, who has spent an extensive amount of time updating the family story, and in particular, the Cooper family story. I have tried to avoid retelling the material in those 2 books. Also, if the place names, and I'm going to throw out a lot of them, if they're not familiar to you, no worries. They're not really important to the story. But I do want to lay a little bit of background as to what was happening in his time. It can be difficult to relate the important the importance of changes in the 1930s and 1940s that drove my grandfather's career path, just as they might have a hard time today imagining our challenges. I've been to Big Bend more than a dozen times in the last few years, chasing the light and following my grandfather's footprints. Sometimes literally, as these photos from K-Bar east of Chisos. My grandfather's photo is on the upper left, and mine is on the upper right. Actually took me about 4 or 5 visits into the K-Bar area of the park to find this specific set of rocks in this specific location. My grandfather is and has always been unabashedly a hero in my eyes. Respected in his community, a famous photographer and explorer, an adventurer delving into the deepest, darkest jungles of South America, trading beads for intricately carved primitive household artifacts. I never tired of telling his story and placing him in the pantheon of heroes reflected in the basin of Big Bend. Each time I visit Big Bend and stand in the basin, almost without fail, I recite the names of the encircling mountains and the accomplishments of their namesakes. Starting to the left of the window, if you're familiar with that area, we have Ward Mountain, named after Johnny Ward, a cowboy of the G4 Ranch, a major 19th century ranching operation found in 1885 that spanned the western half of the park. Next is Amon Carter, the Fort Worth, Texas newspaper publisher of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, who helped raise awareness of the park and the needs for money to acquire the land to make it a national park. Then Vernon Bailey Mountain. Bailey was a USDA field naturalist who conducted biological surveys throughout Texas, in particular in the Trans-Pecos area. And then Bill Pulliam, a prominent pioneer rancher. Calvin C. Huffman, a legislator who sponsored the 1941 legislation providing crucial funding for land acquisition. Roger Toll, on the other side of Casa Grande, Toll Mountain. Roger Toll was a mountaineer and NPS National Park Service superintendent of Yellowstone, who came to the area to judge the worthiness of the park and died in an automobile accident days after declaring that the Big Bend country was decidedly the most scenic area in Texas. Major William H. Emery was a cartographer and chief surveyor for the U.S. Commission who mapped the Texas border in 1844. And then finally, there's Everett Point on the other side of on the southern end of the Chisos, which overlooks the vast Tornillo Basin to the east and the Sierra Quemada and Rio Grande to the south. Meg introduced us to the father of Big Bend Natural Park. I don't know if my grandfather ever met Townsend. Their times didn't quite overlap, but I think in many ways they would have been simpatico. Peter Koch, or Pico, as he was known by some of his friends, Peter Koch and the Koch family arrived relatively late in the history of the park. In 1945, after the natural features of the park were named, so there is no Pico Point. But in my boyhood eyes, and still today, he's right up there with Townsend and the rest. Maybe Pico Point is the little ice cream cone lighthouse-looking thing on the western shoulder of Emery. My talk today centers around the story behind his influential point of view and the roles he played in park promotion. He explored the beauty and natural history of Big Bend, initially in pursuing a career in filmmaking. By the mid-20th century, Peter Koch had become one of the biggest promoters of the then-established national park. With Helen Maxwell, he published and illustrated the first tourist handbook, A Guide for the Big Bend. In the late 40s, he traveled widely through the Northeast and Midwest, promoting the natural beauty of the park. And for several years, he distributed postcards illustrating the Big Bend country. He wrote articles and provided cover photos for Texas Parade. Later, he worked as the executive vice president of the Highway 90 Association, promoting tourism along the Highway 90 corridor, and ran the Alpine Chamber of Commerce before retiring to Studio Butte at the western gate of the park. My grandfather was just 6 feet tall, just under 6 feet tall, with wavy black hair, lean body, and tough. He would hike the desert carrying only his camera, a woolen blanket for sleep that night, and cans of Vienna sausage or Spam for nourishment. Water he knew where to find, in the desert. He would never complain about his health or the weather, and his love of nature was profound. Roger Torrey Peterson and James Fisher, in their book Wild America, refer to him as a brilliant photographer of Big Bend's natural beauty and as one of those fabulous individualists one sometimes meets at outposts such as Hot Springs and Big Bend. Graceful in his stride as an Indian and tireless, he knows those lonely desert mountains and river canyons as does no one else. Koch was quiet about his accomplishments, but deep in his understanding of the pulse of Big Bend. His photography and writing are evidence of his love of the desert, its flowering cactus, and the mysteries of the archaic Indians that left so many traces in the park. He was an explorer. He liked to understand the roots of things. In order to demonstrate that Amerindians had sufficient skills and materials to have also explored the canyons, he traversed the Santa Elena Canyon in a vessel, this one, composed of century plant blossoms and baling wire. This is before Thor Heyerdahl, if you remember him, before Heyerdahl had crossed the Pacific Ocean in the Kon-Tiki, made of locally sourced balsa wood, to make a similar point about the origin of the Polynesians. Koch hiked 25 miles up Rough Run Creek, from Studi Butte to Onion Flat, examining the lands and documenting sites of Amerindian habitation. My favorite trip with him was to walk with him west from the Marathon Road to the Painted Desert at the headwaters of the Tornillo Creek as he searched for a specific species of cactus in bloom. He was also a storyteller. His strength was in communication with his camera through small group meetings such as this one we're having tonight. It was a time before television, PBS, Nova, Marty Stauffer's Wild America. Those didn't happen. Independent explorers and cinematographers would undertake outstanding natural color motion picture lectures at museums, libraries, and community centers. My father's family had arrived in Big Bend first in 1929. Their home doubled as Cooper's Store, a regional landmark selling ice, cold cuts, soft drinks, beer, gasoline, and a cafe to serve meals. Roger Toll remarked in 1934 on one of the few gasoline filling stations in the area, operated by Mr. Cooper and known as Persimmon City. The newspapers called it Cooperville. Many stories have been told about their time and the impact of the Depression, the drought of the early 30s when it did not rain for 3 years. And stories have been told of the heartbreak of the ranchers who were excited by the development of the state park that preceded the national park, but devastated by the loss of their family homes when discovering that the national park would take their homesteads. It was like a death in the family, said Homer Wilson's daughter. The Coopers' land was taken and evidence of their lives virtually erased. The outer shell of the final Cooper store is the last evidence of their presence and serves today as a north entrance visitor station. Will Cooper left the park in 1942 and moved to Marfa. There are many stories about Will, but this is a tale about Peter. Boom, boom, boom. There we go. As my father's family exited, my mother's family arrived on the 24th of February, 1945. They were part of the very last wave of pilgrims moving to the last American frontier in the lower 48. As you can read in Lizards and Exploring, the Kochs were en route to Arizona to finish 2 natural history films and begin another, and for my grandmother to recover her health from debilitating asthma. While in the Smoky Mountains, the Park Service asked Koch to swing by the newly established Big Bend National Park and take some photos for their files. They provided the film, which was important because this was World War II and it was rationed. Hence, my mother's family arrived in Big Bend about 6 months after the park opened with plans to stay for 2 weeks. There were very few staff and fewer visitors, but they immediately recognized the beauty that Townsend had seen when he became one of the first to visualize the park. The scene was so unexpected, so spectacular, we gasped when we saw for the first time this view of incredible beauty. The valley was surrounded by sparsely vegetated mountains, spiked with pink rock formations that rose on all sides in rugged spires and cliffs. They changed their mind and decided to stay for the summer. Big Bend was not an unexplored wilderness when they arrived. Cabeza de Vaca had passed through Big Bend. The land had been surveyed by Emery in 1852 and Robert Hill in 1899. And Lieutenant Eccles and the Camel expeditions had cut across the area twice. The major landmarks had been named. Ranchers had explored the area for water, feed, and missing livestock, and miners for the promise of wealth. And as it became to be considered for a national park, a few more surveyors and naturalists had briefly explored the area. But necessity drives the goals of exploration. The needs of cowboys and miners and the depth of study of itinerant surveyors, biologists, and naturalists are different from those of a philosopher who is also a naturalist, photographer, and explorer. One area of particular interest to my grandfather was the scattered evidence of past inhabitants. We did that slide. Was the scattered evidence of past inhabitants. Although the Spanish had named this Tierra Despoblado, or uninhabited lands, there is abundant evidence that for more than 10,000 years, Amerindians had embraced hunter-gatherer and farming lifestyles there, and left traces of their cultures in grinding holes, pictographs, petroglyphs, stone tools, and scattered rock shelters throughout the country, especially in areas marked with hoodoos, chimneys, or tent rocks. Hoodoos are not merely rock formations to them, but deeply embedded in their cultural identity as sacred sites with spiritual and cautionary figures. With the expulsion of the indigenous inhabitants in the early 1880s, ranchers and miners took up stake in the park. The coming of the railroad was the final blow to the region Despoblado. Alpine is founded in 1882. And in 1883, Marfa gets a post office, and Marathon gets a post office, and Marfa was established as a water stop on the railroad. By the 1920s, ranches encircled the Chizos. Primarily on the Sotol grasslands of the lower foothills. By the time the park was established in the 1940s, there were numerous small ranching operations and communities with dozens of families, white and Mexican, living in what became the park in 1944. The G4 Ranch, which later became the Blue Creek or Homer Wilson Ranch on the southwest, Sam Nail's Ranch on the Burro Mesa area, Johnson's Ranch in the south, the Rosillos Mountain Ranch in the north, the Rice family properties in Grapevine Hills and in the saddle between the Chizos and the Chilicotl Mountains, and of course the Coopers, the Persimmon Gap. There were farming communities along the Rio Grande, especially at Terlingua Baja, Santa Elena, San Vicente, La Noria, and larger communities at Castellon and Boquillas, Texas, along the Rio Grande and Glen Springs, south of the Chizos. There were active mining activities in Boquillas, Mariscal, Studi Butte, and of course Terlingua. So this was no longer a country despoblado, if it had ever been, nor entirely a country inexplorado, or totally unexplored. Big Bend had an outline, but plenty of unfilled holes. So while Big Bend was not an unexplored wilderness, it offered unique opportunities for someone whose goal was to establish a career taking advantage of the newest technology and express his love of nature, producing educational documentaries about a region unknown to the public. Peter Koch was born 9th of October, 1904, the fifth of 6 children, in a tiny Romanian village called Sandra, or Chandru, or Chandrahaso, depending on the whim of the rulers, and located about 20 miles from the nearest proper town, Hatzfeld, Romania. He immigrated to the U.S. with his family at age 7 to join his father in Cincinnati. All Koch would remember from those years was that he was always hungry in Romania, and that the transatlantic passage was miserable. A dreadful 3-week trip through rough seas, crowded, uncomfortable living conditions in their steerage quarters beneath the ship's prow. This image, shot by legendary photographer Albert Stieglitz, aptly shows those uncomfortable conditions. After Stieglitz had identified the potential of this famous view of life in the lowest cost, lowest class of accommodations, he ran back to his stateroom to retrieve his camera, set up his equipment, and no one had moved. So boring was the passage. Koch quit high school at the advice of a teacher. School was too slow. He learned the basics of photography as a Boy Scout, and at 18 found his place at the major Cincinnati afternoon newspaper, the Cincinnati Times-Star, first in the advertising department and then in the photography department. In 1930, at age 24, he was promoted to chief photographer, where he worked with Cincinnati society and sports stars, discovered the clue that convicted a serial murderer, walked away from an airplane crash, and paddled the flooded streets for days to record Cincinnati's Great Flood of 1937, and witnessed a revolution in photographic communication demonstrated with the birth of Time and Life magazines. Meanwhile, not far from the newspaper offices was the Cincinnati Museum of Natural History. Here he established relationships with the scientists and naturalists and began spending spare time with them in the field. Among his group of very close friends was Carl Maslowski, this guy in the upper left, who went on to become the president of the Ohio Audubon Society and became a wildlife photography legend in the Midwest. And Goody Pastor, in the bottom right of that, the picture on the left, a naturalist and notable collector for the University of Illinois in the 1940s. He was also an outdoorsman and a developing environmentalist, joining others of the time who were weary of the age of environmental exploitation. His weekends and vacations were increasingly out in the field. He styled himself photographer, naturalist, and explorer. These were modern times, and there was an explosion of new technology. There were significant advances in atomic physics, plastics, and synthetic materials. This was the machine age. New inventions included the helicopter, the walkie-talkie, synthetic rubber and fertilizer, and the electric guitar. This is important to the story because a large incentive to Koch's drive to be a filmmaker lie in the rapid progression in the tools of photography. The interwar era brought advances in small, high-precision machining, and global demand encouraged rapid modernization. As Koch is beginning his career at the Times-Star in late 20s and early 30s, revolutions in the field of photography are changing the landscape. In a short period of time, there were several commercial advances in photography that offered opportunity to one whose aim was to produce high-quality documentaries and establish a reputation as an explorer and naturalist. In 1925, Leica galvanized a revolution, introducing the first camera, a little smaller, introducing the first camera to use 35mm black and white film that was widely available and easy to use. It had been used for more than 30 years as a stock film in cinematography. Soon this combination of the small camera and 35mm roll film provided the nuance, detail, and dynamic range necessary for many, especially the pioneers in photojournalism and street photography. For these users, this camera soon replaced the bulky, boxy, single-lens reflex box cameras. The fine art photographers continued to use large format medium. And usually cameras with tilt and shift controls, like this one, which allows it to change the perspective of the plane of good focus, and other things which we could spend 5 minutes on, but aren't really the point of this discussion. Quite sophisticated. And then in the early 30s, there was the introduction of Kodachrome. Kodak opened color photography to the wildlife cinematographer. The film was extremely difficult to process, and even to the end it had to be sent elsewhere before it was discontinued a few years ago. It was only available in limited sizes. Fine art photographers demanded large format film for the film's ultimate detail and the ability of the photographer to control the development and adjust scenic contrast. I brought today this camera, a Graflex miniature speed graphics manufactured over the period of 1939 to 1946. It was probably Koch's final camera for the Time Star. A similar camera was used filming the Marines raising the American flag on Iwo Jima in 1945. It's obvious that the box camera, this is a tiny one. If you wanted to shoot 4x5 film, you're talking about an instrument that's about so big. It's obviously less bulky than the box camera, and it was clumsy, the box camera, to carry into the field. Koch began to feel that the quality of the new technology was the opportunity to launch a new career, as the North American consciousness of the environment was also changing and was being appreciated, and there was increased appreciation of the conservation movement. He purchased the Cinegraphic, here on the right, the Cine Kodak Special. It's actually not one of those four, but here's the cameras over here. In colonial times, nature was an obstacle, something feared and often a challenger to defend one's home against. By the mid-18th century, nature had become a resource to be exploited on an industrial scale, and by the mid-19th century, we have squalid urban and rural scenarios and sordid narratives that you remember from the books Great Expectations and A Christmas Carol. By the mid-19th century, the art world had fully embraced landscape as a respectable genre, finally. Frederick Edwin Church and Albert Bierstadt among its stars. Henry Thoreau's Walden or Life in the Woods was published in 1854. Nature in the mid-19th century was becoming something to be appreciated and respected for itself. By the late 19th century, many Americans had come to think of nature as something to be preserved. The first national park, Yellowstone, was established in 1872. And by the first decade of the 20th century, President Theodore Roosevelt had elevated conservation from a niche concern to a core federal responsibility, protecting 230 million acres of public land. The first national park in Texas was established on D-Day, June 6, 1944, when the deed to the Big Bend National Park was given by Texas to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Meanwhile, this was a challenging time at the homestead for Pete and Etta. By 1944, they had 3 healthy young daughters, aged 11, 7, and 1.5. They lived a modest but comfortable life in the quiet, rural community of Terrace Park, a few miles east of Cincinnati, and in the middle of civilization. Etta, however, had debilitating asthma, and treatments of that time were primitive. Jasmine weed cigarettes seems to be the most common prescription. Her doctor advised the healthy, arid climate of Arizona. So in 1944, Koch requests a one-year leave of absence, buys a 23-foot trailer, and that September they're off for Arizona. They'd hoped to find the healthy air would help Etta's asthma, and Peter was anxious to start a new career. In order that he could complete 2 of his wildlife films, they traveled by way of Gatlinburg, Tennessee. The Smoky Mountains were ablaze with color, and the family had lovely visits with familiar sights and old friends. While there, the Park Service asked them to swing by this new national park. They'd like some pictures for their files. They'd provide the film. It was important in World War II with rationing. We've heard of their awe when they first arrived in the basin and how their 2-week stay turned into 6 months. And then they stayed for the rest of their lives. What drove his vision? I think it's easy to surmise that he saw cinematography as storytelling. Indeed, his first step was to outline that which would describe each scene and what it would entail. This is before storyboarding. Of course, these steps he undertook were informed by his study of nature. He was always a naturalist first, and he would know the story to tell as a news photographer. He would know the importance of defining that story in order to find the picture. And as an artist, he had the means and now the knowledge to know how to capture this story. As a photographer, he understood the strengths and weaknesses of his media. His vision drove him to explain the world around him. Mom writes in their book that he didn't like to talk about composition. He'd choose a point of view and an angle that told the nature story that he saw. He would later carry over this filmmaking approach to his slide photography. He tells a story of the visions or the intentions told by 3 renowned fine art photographers as they visited the Big Bend: Ansel Adams, Joseph Munch, and Dmitri Kessel. Adams wanted one photograph that covered the gamut. A picture with the Rio Grande, the Chisos Mountains, and the desert in between. Munch was looking for a particular arrangement: foreground of cactus, midground of pinyon pine, towering dark mountains in the background, and fleecy clouds above all. Kessel wanted to show how life survived in the heat and the sun, the story of the stark, unyielding elements of the desert. Koch also discussed this topic with hundreds of other naturalists, travelers, and workers in many fields, and concluded that a variety of intentions motivated photographers, and that variety was also what he should look for, including in a travel adventure film. A film should move beyond just teaching the science, geology, and natural history. A successful show would include adventurous exploration to engage the audience. I've only seen my grandfather boastful on one occasion. He would recount that the producers for the wildly famous 1953 Academy Award-winning film, Walt Disney's Living Desert, A True Adventure, scouted his presentation in Philadelphia 3 times to dissect and reproduce methods from his talks in order to tailor their own series of award-winning documentaries. He was frustrated by his lack of access to such equipment as Disney could afford. Work as a naturalist, photographer, and explorer was hard. He wrote about this in his weekly Alpine Avalanche newspaper column and in his book, Exploring the Big Bend Country. He had ongoing expeditions into the corners of Big Bend, summiting the mountains of the Chisos and exploring the deep canyons on the north face of Pulliam. He walked the deserts and explored the headwaters of Rough Run Creek on the west or Tornillo Creek on the east. And along the way, at age 44, he accepted an assignment to go to the heart of South America to explore the deepest, darkest jungles along the Suriname River where only a few white men had ever been allowed to explore. and he'd be gone for 3 months. Etta, my grandmother, and their 3 daughters are left in the wilderness park, connected to the civilized world by a day-long drive over rough desert roads to the tiny town of Marathon, or through the single shortwave radio at park headquarters. Fortunately, the mail was delivered weekly to this wilderness, and my grandmother recruited as company her cousin, Josephine Schwartz, a distinguished Dayton, Ohio ballerina. While the family moved to Hot Springs, 100 yards from Mexico, under the supervision of Maggie Smith, for those months while my grandfather was pursuing his dreams. The Kochs then lived in the Livingston House, located on the hill on the right as you enter the Hot Springs Historic District today. It had a roof then and a petrified wood fireplace, the stones of which had long been chipped off when I was a boy. It had a large floor-to-ceiling crack as well along one wall, a crack that my grandmother disguised by converting it into a blooming century plant, using leftover house paint to cover the wall. In the picture on the left, Josephine Schwartz and Etta Koch are relaxing in front of the fireplace for Christmas in Big Bend. It says Merry Christmas, the little thingy hanging from the roof there. To the right is my family growing up. My younger brother and I are inside, and my mother and sisters are outside the window. Koch's expedition to South America was very successful, and the response played a key part in his photographic journey. For many years, he was well known for his presentations of the Suriname film Flame in the Jungle, but also The Blue Goose Flies South and Along Smoky Mountain Trails, and the 2 films from Big Bend, Life in a Desert Wilderness and Desert Gold. His agent on his lecture tours was the renowned Harold R. Peet, who also represented such speakers as Winston Churchill, H.G. Wells, Amelia Earhart, maybe you've heard of them, a few others. For 5 years, Koch lectured every winter: Denver, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, Columbia, Boston, Buffalo, Memphis, New Orleans, and Texas. His work was always highly appreciated, and the reviews were superlative. He often enjoyed standing room only crowds. For many years, he took along his pet, Golden Eagle, who he had raised since it was abandoned in its nest. Hercules was often the star of his lectures until one day, while on tour, he took off through the open window, inciting a 3-state search, as reported by the Cincinnati Times-Star. Hercules was never found. He was spotted, but never found. My grandfather was not a landscape photographer. I have clear memories of him making this clear. It was surprising to me at that time because I had known and admired something about the work of Ansel Adams, and I was beginning to consider myself a landscape photographer of sorts. I don't remember what his specific arguments were at that time, and it's always puzzled me. For this project, I've spent a considerable amount of time addressing this confusion. Today, I think I understand better why. A naturalist photographer focuses on living elements, wildlife, plants, and ecosystems with the aim to document biodiversity and natural behavior, and to raise awareness of issues regarding ecological balance. The naturalist photographer emphasizes truthful representation over artistic design, though both can be accomplished. This photographer spends their prep time studying the natural history of the area. They would know and recognize the plants and animals. They would have a strong sense of the environment and would pursue a particular target animal or niche and know before beginning everything about them that they could. Images would likely focus on a portrait shot of the target animal or flower, as well as sitting patiently in small, narrow blinds in order to place their target in the right environment. Patience and tolerance are tools as important as the camera and film. The landscape photographer, on the other hand, emphasizes aesthetic beauty and mood over strict documentation, emphasizes scenic views and natural environments, aiming to evoke appreciation of natural beauty through light, composition, and timing. They are more likely to include a plant or animal in a supporting role in showing how they fit into the environment. Because I enjoy understanding how things work, I try to understand the underlying biology and geology, but these fields are beyond my ken. Although I think I understand more than many park visitors and can identify perhaps 95% of the named natural features in the park, at least those seen from the improved and unimproved roads. Both types of photographers seek to celebrate and protect the natural environment and inspire environmental awareness. Both require a deep patience and observation, and both depend upon an understanding of natural light, weather, and ecology. Both will find themselves crossing over to the other camp, with a naturalist photographer shooting landscapes and the landscape photographer documenting nature as a primary subject. To be effective, both will isolate a picture of the scene in their mind, focus their senses, select a subject and supporting cast, frame the scene, and check for elements that will strengthen or weaken the composition. Both aim to produce work with the intention of providing a unique point of view that allows the viewer to put themselves in the photographer's shoe, and an experience that compels the viewer to take another look at the image. Both will become a spokesperson for the environment and an advocate for its protection. This is all to say that my intention and my grandfather's intention are different, but often overlap. I will also emphasize that the photographs I've seen, and that those that we showed at the beginning, or before the actual start of this program, were chosen by me primarily because they're crossover landscapes. There are other potential explanations for this objection to the landscape photographer label. By the early 20th century, a term called naturalism photography had been promoted by Emerson. This came to mean the exclusion of the extensive manipulation in the gauzy, soft focus images of the pictorialist movement, like you see on the right. It had begun to mean a direct reflection of the landscape as it existed, and was perhaps a forerunner of the F-64 everything is sharp movement. Furthermore, there is the problem that fine art landscape photography was almost exclusively done in black and white in those times. Commercial color photography was a new phenomenon, and the critics had been very unkind. Of landscapes shot in color. Even the work of established giants such as Alfred Stieglitz, Ansel Adams, and Elliott Porter had their color work shredded in their early work. Koch had certainly worked in black and white during his newspaper years, and undoubtedly this also meant being comfortable with the fundamentals of black and white development and printing. His attempts at darkroom work in West Texas, however, were unacceptable. There was too much dust to fight in that environment. Landscape photography, as defined in the 1940s, was not an option for him. Finally, color slides and photographs were long not considered to be fine art. The first solo exhibition of color photographs at the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art was in 1979. As it happens, I saw this Elliott Porter show, Intimate Landscapes, which blew me away. Koch, who shot color slides, would not have been considered a fine art landscape photographer in the mid-20th century. Koch's film success had come from his well-received presentations to audiences such as this. Citizens who attend special presentations at their local museum or community center, narrated by an adventurer or expert themselves. Koch offered in film, a pre-planned storied narrative developed before he began shooting and presenting a variety of views to the experiences to the viewer. He would describe the natural history and demonstrate how it fit into a big story, himself, standing in front of his films. And there must always be adventure and an element of danger. He did the same in his slideshows. His filmmaking came to an end because the technology waves he grabbed onto had continued to advance, and filmmaking had become more refined with the simultaneous collection of light and sound. And the distribution had moved beyond bespoke museum and educational venues into commercial theaters with mass distribution networks. But in parallel, as changes were occurring in the movie technology, still cameras and slide projection systems evolved. Kodak color slide reversal film offered another direction for him. These slides, as you might know, were small with a cellulose or polyester film base and contained a 24 by 36 inch image that was too small to be conveniently viewed in hand, but were designed to be projected by an updated magic lantern system, as they were then called. In the 1950s, as he's losing advantage in filmmaking, compact 35 millimeter slide projectors were developed, which threw the image from the tiny slides to the big screen, and more importantly, utilized cassettes holding 80 slides at a time. The Kodak carousel was introduced in 1961 with a gravity-fed, jam-resistant technology, which was easier, faster, and more reliable. Later, dissolve units alternated projections from more than one unit for a multimedia experience. As this equipment became available and developed into an effective means of communicating the stories he had previously shot for his cinema work, he focused on 35 millimeter format. Myself, I consider myself a landscape photographer. I am, unlike my grandfather, who understands and seeks to present the pulse of nature while also employing compositional tools to show beauty. I tend to be more like Joseph Munch, mentioned above in the three photographer style section, in that I see the art of composition as the art of arranging forms, foreground pieces, mid-ground forms, background sets, sky above, are all masses in color, and my primary intention is usually to arrange these to be pleasing, while also telling the other stories. And I still see in Big Bend the desolate beauty of nature. My grandfather, by years of conversations with leading biologists and scientists, came to develop a profound understanding of how things worked. But photography is my second career. So when I visit a new area, I spend my preparation time studying the landscape and potential perspectives using what tools I can. Google Maps, Google Earth, all trails for potential routes. I review coffee table art books covering the area, field guides, and when available, I'll flip through the How to Photograph the Park books. More recently, YouTube has become an interesting visual source of exploration. I was in Big Bend last week with my son, Peter. After 2 days of walking through the desert and exploring some of my favorite spots that I'd explored with my grandfather, Peter, we backpacked to the campsite at East Rim 6, just west of Townsend Point. It was grueling. By the time I got back, my watch said I needed 96 hours of recovery time. I'm pretty certain that'll be my last trip. But when I arrived back at the lodge, I recited the names and the heroes of the mountains and peaks of the basin. Townsend Point, Ward Mountain, Amon Carter and Vernon Bailey Peaks, Pulliam Peak, Mount Huffman, Casa Grande, Toll Mountain, Emory Peak, And on Emory's western shoulder, the little ice cream cone or lighthouse thing that for me will always be Pico Point. Thank you.